Chapter 1. Introduction. Why German-Turkish history is so fascinating. Imagine that two countries are geographically far apart, and yet their histories have been closely intertwined for centuries. On the one hand, Germany, the heart of Central Europe, with its eventful history between the German Empire, world wars, and reunification. On the other hand, Turkey, once the center of the mighty Ottoman Empire, later a young nation-state that reinvented itself between tradition and modernity. The connection between these two countries is much older than many think. It does not begin with the famous guest workers of the 1960s. Centuries earlier, there had been encounters: merchants, diplomats, travelers, later soldiers and scientists. They all weaved an invisible bond between Central Europe and Anatolia. But why should we deal with this story today? The answer is obvious, because it shows us why our present is the way it is. Today, more than 3 million people with Turkish roots live in Germany. They are no longer just immigrants, but part of society, part of culture, part of German history. They have shaped our cities, with restaurants, clubs, mosques, but also with art, music, and literature. And at the same time, German-Turkish relations are still full of tension today, sometimes characterized by friendship and cooperation, sometimes by conflicts and misunderstandings. Anyone who wants to understand why debates about integration, migration, or Turkey's role in Europe are so passionate must know the roots. Our journey through history will therefore not be a dry list of years. It is a narrative full of encounters and ruptures, full of hopes and disappointments. We will see how German emperors negotiated with Ottoman sultans, how Turkish students studied in Berlin in the 1920s, how millions of workers sought their fortune in the factories of the economic miracle, and how their children and grandchildren have grown up between two worlds today. This story is fascinating because it has so many facets. It tells of alliances between empires and empires that once stood together against their opponents. She tells of people who left their homeland to build a new life on the Rhine or the Ruhr. It tells of culture that overcomes borders, from doner kebabs to German hip-hop. But she also tells of conflicts, of racism and prejudice, of mistrust and political tensions. It is precisely this mixture that makes it so exciting. So that we don't get lost in this long and multi-layered story, we will tell it in chapters, just like a novel with many characters. We start with the first contacts in the Ottoman Empire, move on to the friendship between Berlin and Constantinople in the 19th century, the Common War, the migration of the 1960s, and the debates of our present. In the end, we will understand not only how Turks came to Germany, but also why they stayed, and how guest workers became neighbors, friends, and politicians. So, sit back, join me on this journey, and let's immerse ourselves in over 500 years of German-Turkish history. Chapter 2. First Contacts in the Ottoman Empire. If we want to tell the story of German-Turkish relations, we have to go back a long way, to a time when Germany was not yet a united nation-state and Turkey did not yet exist. At that time, in the 16th century, a powerful empire was at the center of world politics, the Ottoman Empire. From Istanbul, the sultans ruled over 3 continents: the Middle East, North Africa, and large parts of southeastern Europe. Germany, on the other hand, was then a patchwork of principalities, duchies, and free imperial cities, loosely held together by the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. But even if the two worlds were far apart at first glance, they came into contact, sometimes through trade, sometimes through war, sometimes through diplomacy. The Turkish threat in Europe. In the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire was at the height of its power. Under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans conquered Vienna in 1529, and this marked the beginning of a time in Central Europe in which the Turkish threat shaped thinking and politics. In pamphlets, sermons, and songs, the Ottomans were often portrayed as a threat, as the other against whom Christians and Europeans had to unite. And yet, in addition to fear, there was also fascination. Travelers reported on the splendor of the Sultan's court, on colorful bazaars in Istanbul, and on a culture that seemed exotic and mysterious at the same time. The image of the Turks fluctuated between horror and admiration. Diplomacy and legations. Early on, German princes and emperors began to establish diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire. One of the most famous travelers was Augir Ghiselin de Busbecq, an envoy of the Habsburg emperor who lived at the court in Istanbul in the 1550s. His letters about life in the Ottoman Empire, from the power of the Sultan to exotic plants and animals, caused a sensation in Europe. German traders and adventurers also sought their fortune in the Ottoman Empire. Cities such as Istanbul, Aleppo, or Izmir became hubs where goods and people met. First cultural encounters. With the travelers, culture also came to Central Europe. Coffee, carpets, exotic spices, many things that we take for granted today came to Germany for the first time in these ways. The German language also picked up traces. Words such as yogurt, kiosk, or tulip originally come from Turkish or, via detours, from Ottoman. Between fascination and enmity. The first centuries of German-Turkish relations were characterized by this double image. On the one hand, the military opponent in front of Vienna, and on the other hand, the fascinating trading partner in the East. Even then, something became apparent that accompanies history to this day, a relationship full of ambivalences. While Central Europe often wanted to distance itself from the Turks, at the same time, they adopted many of them, be it in fashion, in the kitchen, or in diplomacy. Chapter 3. The 19th Century. Friendship between Berlin and Constantinople. The 19th century marked the beginning of a new era in relations between Germans and Ottomans. In Europe, nation-states were formed, industrialization changed entire societies, and the Ottoman Empire, once a world power, came under increasing pressure. At that time, people spoke of the sick man on the Bosporus. And yet, it was precisely during this time that a special closeness developed between Berlin and Constantinople, which both states tried to exploit for themselves. Prussia and the Ottoman Empire, alliance of interest. The Kingdom of Prussia already sought contact with the Ottoman Empire. It was the idea that two outsiders in the European power structure could benefit from each other. The Ottomans hoped for modern weapons and military aid, while the Prussians saw Istanbul as a partner against their rivals, Austria and Russia. Prussian officers traveled to the Bosporus as military advisors, helped build up modern armies, and brought Prussian austerity to the Ottoman barracks. This resulted in military cooperation that lasted for decades and laid the foundation for growing trust. The Baghdad Railway, rails as a symbol of friendship. A highlight of this rapprochement was the construction of the Baghdad Railway at the end of the 19th century. German engineers planned and built a railway line that was to run from Istanbul via Anatolia to Baghdad. For the Ottomans, this project meant progress and connection to modernity. For the German Empire, it was a prestige object and a step towards expanding its influence in the Middle East. The Baghdad Railway became a symbol. Germany presented itself as a partner who brought not only weapons, but also technology and knowledge. At the same time, however, the project also aroused suspicion among other powers, especially Great Britain, which saw its own interests in the region at risk. Cultural contacts and fascination for the Orient. In the 19th century, more and more German scientists, archaeologists, and artists traveled to the Ottoman Empire. They brought back stories and treasures that shaped the image of the Orient in Berlin, Munich, and Leipzig. In Germany, a veritable enthusiasm for the Orient arose. Fairy tales from 1001 Nights became popular, Turkish carpets and Oriental cafes found their way to Central Europe. At the same time, Ottoman students and diplomats came to Germany to study here, a small but important beginning of migration which was to play a major role in the 20th century. A friendship with a dark side. As close as the relations became, they also remained determined by self-interest. For Germany, the proximity to the Ottoman Empire was above all a question of power politics. For the Ottomans, on the other hand, it was a matter of survival. They hoped to be able to compensate for the weakness of the empire with German help. It was a relationship that resembled a friendship, but was always characterized by strategic calculation. And yet, without this rapprochement in the 19th century, the alliance that was to follow in the First World War would hardly have been conceivable. Chapter 4. The First World War. Brothers in Arms. When the First World War broke out in the summer of 1914, the major European powers stood against each other. On the one hand, the Central Powers, above all the German Empire and Austria-Hungary, and on the other hand, the Entente with Great Britain, France, and Russia. In the midst of this conflict, the Ottoman Empire made a momentous decision. It sided with Germany. The League of Brothers in Arms. For both sides, this alliance was more than just a tactical partnership. Germany needed a strong partner in the southeast to put pressure on Russia and Great Britain. The Ottoman Empire, on the other hand, hoped to save its dwindling power through German support. So the two kingdoms became brothers in arms. German officers helped to expand the Ottoman army, German ships entered the Bosporus, and they fought together on the fronts of the Middle East. Jihad as propaganda. A special feature of this alliance was propaganda. The Ottoman government, on behalf of the Sultan, who was also Caliph, called for jihad against the enemies, a kind of holy war against the Entente powers. In Berlin, it was hoped that this would persuade Muslim subjects in the opponent's colonies, for example in India or North Africa, to revolt. The idea that millions of Muslims could fight for Germany was tempting. In reality, however, the effect remained limited. Common battles. On the fronts of the First World War, German and Ottoman soldiers fought side by side. The Battle of Gallipoli, 1915-16, became particularly famous, in which Ottoman troops under Mustafa Kemal, the later Ataturk, repelled the British and French attacks with German support. The alliance was also noticeable in Palestine, Mesopotamia, and the Caucasus. German officers served as advisors, while the Ottoman Empire mobilized its last military resources. The common downfall. But as close as the brotherhood in arms was, fate sealed them together. In 1918, both empires emerged from the war as losers. The German Empire collapsed in the revolution, and the Kaiser had to abdicate. The Ottoman Empire was on the verge of final collapse. The defeat led to drastic consequences. In Germany, the Weimar Republic began, while in Anatolia, a struggle for freedom arose under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Modern Turkey was to emerge from this movement. A legacy for the future. The First World War was a turning point. It showed that Germany and Turkey, despite all their differences, found each other at crucial moments. At the same time, however, it also revealed the limits of this alliance. It was less based on friendship than on common interests, and fell apart with the defeat. But the memory of this time remained. Many Germans who went to Turkey in the years that followed, whether as scientists, engineers, or refugees, took up the experiences of this brotherhood in arms. And conversely, the image of the Germans as reliable partners remained in Turkey, an image that was to shape relations for a long time to come. Chapter 5. The Interwar Period and Ataturk. After the First World War, both countries were on the ground. The German Empire had collapsed, the Kaiser was in exile, the young Weimar Republic was fighting for survival. The Ottoman Empire also ceased to exist. With the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, it was to be torn to pieces, and foreign powers claimed Anatolia. But two new states rose from the ruins, the Weimar Republic in Germany and the Turkish Republic under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And this is exactly where a new chapter in German-Turkish relations begins, marked by upheavals, hope, and unusual closeness. The rise of Ataturk. Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli, led the War of Independence against the occupying powers. In 1923, he proclaimed the Republic of Turkey in Ankara and abolished the Sultanate and Caliphate. His goal was radical, a modern, secular state based on the Western model. Turkey turned to Europe, and Germany was one of the countries that played a special role in this. Weimar Republic and Turkey, partners on the margins. Germany was also looking for new partners in the 1920s. Humiliated by the victorious powers of the First World War, the Weimar Republic was internationally isolated. Turkey, which had also rejected a hard peace, appeared as a natural interlocutor. Thus, diplomatic relations developed that were characterized by pragmatism. They respected each other as countries that both fought against adverse circumstances. German scientists in Turkey, contacts became particularly close in the 1930s, and for a tragic reason. In Germany, the National Socialists took power, and many Jewish scientists, artists, and intellectuals had to flee. Turkey opened its doors. Hundreds of professors found a new home at Turkish universities. They built up faculties, modernized the education system, and left lasting traces. Thus, German doctors, lawyers, architects, and musicians became part of the Turkish reform era. In Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir, entire institutes were established that were dominated by German exiles. Turkey became a place of refuge for them and an engine of modernization for Turkey itself. Between neutrality and caution. Politically, Turkey held back cautiously in the interwar period. It did not want a new war and concentrated on internal construction. Germany, on the other hand, was increasingly shaped by National Socialism. Despite these differences, mutual respect remained. Ataturk saw Germany as a modern industrial country from which one could learn. Many Turks studied in Berlin or Leipzig, and German companies invested in infrastructure projects on the Bosporus. A new foundation. The interwar period laid a foundation that went far beyond the political level. It was above all people who shaped German-Turkish relations: scientists, students, diplomats, artists. Their stories show that this connection was not only made up of treaties and alliances, but of encounters, from exchange, from joint projects. And even though the Second World War was soon to change everything, this era remained a symbol of the fact that Germany and Turkey not only knew war alliances, but also a partnership in times of peace. Chapter 6: World War II and the Post-War Period. With the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, the world changed again. Germany was under the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler, and Europe plunged into disaster. Turkey, on the other hand, was in a difficult position. Strategically located between Europe, the Middle East, and the Black Sea, it was of great importance for both warring parties. Turkey between the fronts. The Turkish leadership under President İsmet İnönü opted for a policy of neutrality. Ankara wanted to avoid being drawn into the maelstrom of war at all costs. That was easier said than done. Germany was pushing for an alliance. The Allies, above all Great Britain and the Soviet Union, wanted to get Turkey on their side. Ankara skillfully maneuvered between the two camps. For example, Turkey temporarily supplied chromium, an important metal for the arms industry, to Germany, while at the same time remaining diplomatically linked to the Allies. It was only at the very end of the war, in February 1945, that Turkey declared war on Germany, but only symbolically, in order to be able to become a member of the United Nations. German refugees in Turkey. As in the 1930s, many German Jews and opponents of the regime fled to Turkey during the war. Universities in Istanbul and Ankara became important places of exile. For Turkey, this was not only an act of humanity, but also a gain. The refugees brought knowledge, ideas, and modern structures. The Turkish music, architecture, and medicine of this period would hardly be conceivable without the German exiles. Turkey after 1945, a new course towards the West. With the end of the Second World War, the geopolitical situation changed dramatically. Germany was defeated and divided into zones. Although Turkey had retained its independence, it was now overshadowed by the beginning of the Cold War. The Soviet Union demanded territorial claims and wanted access to the straits on the Bosporus. As a result, Turkey moved closer to the Western powers. In 1952, she joined NATO, a decisive step that permanently bound her to the West. First contacts with post-war Germany. Contacts with Germany also continued, despite the destruction and the political new beginning. Turkish students came to Germany early on to study and take advantage of the new opportunities. It was the time when the foundations for the later migration movements were laid. There were still only a few, but the idea that Germany and Turkey would also grow closer together on a human level was already palpable. From war to a new partnership. The period of the Second World War and the immediate post-war period show one thing clearly.
While Turkey retained its neutrality, relations with Germany remained surprisingly stable. It was not a close partnership like in the First World War, but it was not enmity either. And that was exactly what opened up new opportunities after 1945. While Germany had to rebuild itself and Turkey was looking for a place in the Western world, the two countries found each other again. The next chapter would shape their relationship forever, with a treaty that would change the lives of millions, the 1961 Recruitment Agreement.
Chapter 7. The Guest Worker Era, 1961-1973. When you talk about the Turkish community in Germany today, one term almost always comes up: guest workers. Hardly any word has shaped German-Turkish relations as much as this one. But what's behind it? The 1961 Recruitment Agreement. On October 30, 1961, a treaty was signed in Bonn that was to change the history of Germany forever. The Recruitment Agreement between the Federal Republic of Germany and Turkey. The starting point was clear. The economy was booming in West Germany. The economic miracle had brought factories, steel mills, and construction sites full of orders, but there was a shortage of workers. Millions of German men had died in the war. Many women were already working. The gaps had to be filled. Turkey, on the other hand, struggled with high unemployment and economic backwardness. For Ankara, the agreement was an opportunity. Workers could be sent abroad to earn money there and send some of it home. These remittances were a much-needed source of income. Thus began an experiment that no one had foreseen in its full extent. The first guest workers. In the autumn of 1961, the first Turkish workers arrived in Germany by train. A guest worker center was set up at the train station in Cologne-Deutz, which was the first contact with their new life for many. From there, the men and women, initially mainly men, were distributed to all parts of the country. To the steelworks on the Ruhr, to the automotive factories of Stuttgart, to the chemical industry in Ludwigshafen, or to the mining industry in Saarland. They worked in shifts, often in the hardest and dirtiest jobs that German workers no longer wanted to do. Everyday life between work and homesickness. The lives of the first Turkish guest workers were marked by loneliness and deprivation. Many lived in dormitories, where 4 or 6 men were often accommodated together in one room. They worked, sent money home, and saved as best they could. Most believed that they would only stay for a few years. The concept was designed as follows. After 2 years, the workers were to go back to Turkey and new ones were to move in. Germany did not see itself as a country of immigration. The Turks were supposed to be temporary workers. But many quickly realized that the return was not so easy. There was work in Germany, but often not in Turkey. And so they extended their contracts, stayed longer than planned, and unconsciously laid the foundation for permanent migration. Encounters and first tensions. The arrival of the Turks was unusual for many Germans. Suddenly, men with foreign languages, unfamiliar clothing, and other habits appeared in small towns. Some met them with curiosity, others with skepticism or even rejection. The first friendships were formed in the factories, over beer after the shift, or at a football game together. At the same time, however, the differences remained noticeable. Many Turks did not drink alcohol, ate differently, and hardly spoke German. This was the beginning of a coexistence that in the 1960s was not yet intended as integration, but as a pure community of convenience. The illusion of return. It was clear to both sides. The guest workers would leave again at some point. German politicians have repeatedly emphasized that Germany is not an immigration country. Many Turks also saw their life in Germany only as an episode, working for a few years, saving, returning home, perhaps opening a small business or building a house. But the reality was to be quite different. When recruitment was stopped in 1973, hundreds of thousands of Turks were already living in Germany. Many had settled in, made their first friendships, put down their first roots. The guest worker era was not the end, but the beginning of a story that continues to this day.
Chapter 8. Family Reunification and Settling Down, 1973-1990. In 1973, everything changed. As a result of the oil crisis and economic uncertainty, the German government decided to stop the recruitment of guest workers.
Officially, this was intended to limit immigration. In reality, however, this step had a completely different effect. Many of the Turks already living in Germany now decided to bring their families with them. From provisional to permanence. Until then, many Turkish men had lived in Germany as if for a while. Simple dormitories, work shifts, hardly any contacts outside the factory. Their wives and children remained behind in Turkey. But with the recruitment freeze, a new question arose. If they could no longer move back and forth, should they go back to Turkey all the way, or should they stay and start a permanent life in Germany? Most of them decided to stay, because in Germany there was work, wages, and a future that was often not possible in Anatolia. And so began a phase that was to change the face of German cities forever. Family reunification. In the years that followed, hundreds of thousands of Turks brought their wives, children, and sometimes even parents to Germany. The train stations in Cologne, Munich, or Stuttgart became the scene of touching reunions when men were able to embrace their families again after years. For the children, this meant a completely new world. They came to German schools, often learned the language faster than their parents, and stood between two cultures. Many were the first Turks in their classes, sometimes even the first foreigners ever. Emergence of communities. With the families, life in Germany also changed. Individual workers became entire communities. In cities such as Berlin, Cologne, Duisburg, and Stuttgart, districts were created in which Turkish shops, bakeries, and cafes opened. Associations, mosque communities, and cultural centers were established to help people preserve their traditions. At the same time, however, this also ensured that many Turks remained among themselves. In Berlin-Kreuzberg, for example, a district developed in the 1970s and 80s that soon bore the nickname Little Istanbul. Here there were Turkish supermarkets, snack bars, mosques, a piece of home in a foreign country. Between integration and demarcation. German politicians were hardly prepared for this development. It was still said, Germany is not an immigration country. But reality spoke a different language. Hundreds of thousands of Turks lived here permanently. Their children went to German schools, their families built a new life for themselves. This also grew the debate. Should the Turks adapt and become German citizens, or should they keep their own culture and stay only as guests? Many Germans met the new neighbors with skepticism. Clichés of the foreign Turk made the rounds, while Turks often felt that they were not really welcome. Mosques and religion in everyday life. A particularly visible symbol of settling down was religion. Mosques sprang up everywhere, at first often only in backyards or old factory halls, later also as representative new buildings. For many Turks, these places were not only religious, but also social centers. Here you met compatriots, here you could find help with problems, here you felt community. At the same time, however, they also led to discussions. Did Islam fit into German society? First successes and stories. Despite all the difficulties, many Turks began to gain a foothold in the 1980s. Some opened their own restaurants or shops, others made careers in factories or companies. Their children began to graduate from high school and study at universities, a step that opened the way to the middle class. They also left their mark culturally. In the 1980s, the doner kebab, which was invented in Berlin in its current form, became a symbol of the Turkish presence in Germany, and later the country's most popular fast food. Between two worlds. But for many, life remained a balancing act. Turkish was spoken in the family, German outside. During the summer holidays, people went home, but more and more children only knew Turkey from stories. The result was a generation that felt neither entirely Turkish nor fully German, but somewhere in between. Chapter 9. The Turks in Germany and the Question of Integration. With family reunification, it had become clear that the Turks would stay. But this realization was slow to gain acceptance in the minds of politicians and society. Officially, it was still said for a long time, Germany is not a country of immigration. In reality, however, the Federal Republic had long since changed. Millions of people with Turkish roots now live here permanently. And it was precisely this that raised a new question. How can living together succeed? Between integration and assimilation. In the 1970s and 80s, heated debates began about the right way. Should we expect the Turks to give up their language, culture, and traditions and become completely German, i.e. assimilation? Or should they be allowed to preserve their own culture and at the same time be part of society, i.e. integration? Reality was usually a complicated in-between. In many families, only Turkish was spoken at home, while the children learned German at school. Some young people feel at home in both languages, others in none. Education as a key and a problem. The question of integration was particularly visible in the education system. Many children of migrant workers had difficulties at school. Language barriers, lack of parental support, teachers who had no experience in dealing with migrant children. This often led to Turkish children ending up in secondary schools or special schools, and thus having worse chances on the labor market. Integration thus remained not only a question of goodwill, but also of social structures. Work and advancement. It also remained difficult in his professional life. Many Turks continued to work in factories or as unskilled workers. Only slowly did some succeed in taking the step into self-employment, with small shops, supermarkets, restaurants. The doner kebab became a success story during this time. What began as a niche food in the 1970s developed into the most popular fast food in Germany in the 80s and 90s. Small snack bars became entire chains, and Turkish entrepreneurs became a visible part of the German economy. Culture and everyday life. With the settling of the Turks, everyday life in Germany also changed. Turkish food found its way into supermarkets, Turkish music and films found their audience. And in many cities, the annual Feast of Sacrifice, or Ramadan, became a familiar sight for neighbors. But this cultural wealth was not always seen as an enrichment. Some spoke of parallel societies and warned against distancing the Turks. First voices from the community. During this time, political self-organization also began. Turkish associations, cultural centers, and media emerged. The first voices were raised saying, "We are not just guests, we are part of this country." In the second generation, the German-born children of guest workers, a new self-confidence also grew. They asked questions about identity and belonging. Am I Turkish? Am I German? Or something in between? Integration as a task for society as a whole. All this made it clear that integration was not a one-sided process. It was not just about Turks learning German and adopting German values. It was also about German society accepting that it was changing as a result of immigration. It was precisely at this point that a debate broke out that continues to this day. How much change can a country tolerate? And what does German actually mean when millions of people from other cultures belong to it? Chapter 10. The 1990s. Between xenophobia and recognition. The 1990s were a decade of contrasts. On the one hand, people with Turkish roots became more and more visible in Germany, as entrepreneurs, artists, footballers, politicians. On the other hand, this time was marked by fear, violence, and xenophobia. It was a decade in which the question of belonging was asked particularly painfully. The shock of Meln and Solingen. In November 1992, an arson attack in the small town of Meln in Schleswig-Holstein shook the country. Right-wing extremists had set fire to a house where Turkish families lived. 3 people died, 2 little girls and their grandmother. Only half a year later, in May 1993, the next catastrophe followed. In Solingen, 5 women and girls of a Turkish family died when neo-Nazis set fire to their house. These attacks made it clear how endangered the lives of migrants in Germany were. For many Turks, it was a shock. They had hoped to have a secure future in Germany and had to experience that they were met with hatred and violence. The funeral processions and demonstrations after the attacks became a turning point. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets and shouted, "Never again." At the same time, a new debate began about racism, integration, and the responsibility of the state. Political debates about citizenship. The 1990s were also a time of intense political discussions. For a long time, the Jus sanguinis, the right of blood, applied in Germany. This meant that anyone who had German parents was German. Those who were born in Germany but had foreign parents remained foreigners. This was a problem for the children of Turkish guest workers. Many were born in Germany, spoke German, only knew Turkey from vacation trips, and yet were not considered Germans. The demand for reform became louder. Although it took until 2000 for the citizenship law to be really changed, the discussion began as early as the 1990s, and it was closely linked to the experiences of the Turkish community. Rise of Turkish entrepreneurs and artists. At the same time, however, there was also another development. More and more Turks became self-employed, opening restaurants, travel agencies, supermarkets, or construction companies. Small businesses became successful companies that created jobs, also for Germans. German Turks also became more visible in art and culture. In the 1990s, Turkish film celebrated its first successes in Germany, and musicians such as Muhabbet or later Kul Savas and Azad began to shape German hip-hop with Turkish roots. Football as a bridge. Football was a special field. Players like Yildiray Baştürk or later Mesut Özil showed that children of Turkish guest workers could make it into the German national team. Football became a place where integration could succeed, and a symbol of the fact that even as a child of Turkish parents, you could represent Germany. Between fear and self-confidence. For example, life in the 1990s was a contradiction for many Turks in Germany. On the one hand, the self-confidence of being part of the country grew. On the other hand, the fear of racism and exclusion remained. But it was precisely in this tension that a new generation emerged that was no longer just guest worker children, but developed its own identity. German Turks who said, "We belong, whether you like it or not." Chapter 11. The New Generation. German Turks Between Two Worlds. In the 2000s, it was clear that Turks in Germany are no longer guests, they are part of society. But how does the generation that was born and grew up here get along with each other? This is exactly where the story of the German Turks begins, a generation that stands between two worlds and has often created its own identity. Grew up in Germany, with roots in Turkey. Many children and grandchildren of the guest workers speak better German than Turkish. They go to German schools, study at German universities, work in German companies. Germany is their home, and yet they feel the connection to Turkey, whether through their parents' language, through family visits in the summer, or through traditions at home. This life between the worlds is sometimes an enrichment, but sometimes also a balancing act. Because it is not uncommon for them to hear, "You're not a real German." And in Turkey, they often feel just as foreign. There, they are called Almanji, the Germans. Football stars, musicians, and actors as bridge builders. The new generation made itself visible on football pitches, in music, in the cinema. Football. Players like Mesut Özil, İlkay Gündoğan, and Nuri Şahin became stars who thrilled millions of people. Music. Rappers like Eko Fresh, Kul Savas, or later Capital Bra, with Turkish roots through his mother, shaped the German hip-hop scene. Film and television. Actresses like Sibel Kekili made international careers. They all contributed to the fact that German Turkish faces and stories have arrived in the mainstream. Migration in everyday life. Turkish culture also became part of German society in everyday life. The doner kebab have long since become a national snack. Ramadan and Feast of Sacrifice are terms that are also familiar to non-Muslims. Turkish weddings, Turkish supermarkets, Turkish bakeries, all of this is a matter of course in German cities today. But at the same time, the question remained, is this culture seen as an enrichment or as a foreignness? Identity, German, Turkish, or both? For many of the new generation, identity is not either or, but both and. They say, "I am German and Turkish." But this claim often meets with resistance. Again and again, the question arises, where do you really belong? Especially after political tensions between Berlin and Ankara, this question became louder. Many German Turks react to this with self-confidence. We belong to both worlds, and that is exactly our strength. Humor and self-irony. An exciting development of the 2000s was the rise of German-Turkish comedians such as Kaya Yanar and Bülent Ceylan. With wit and irony, they made the topic of migration suitable for the masses and played with cliches, from the strict Turkish mother to the German obsession with order. Laughter became a bridge between cultures and helped to break down prejudices in a humorous way. The new voice. Unlike their parents and grandparents, the children of the guest workers no longer wanted to be invisible. They wanted to have a say in politics, culture, and the media. More and more German Turks joined parties, founded initiatives, and stood up for their rights. The message was clear: we are not just guests, we are part of this country. Chapter 12: Political Tensions Between Berlin and Ankara. As closely as Germany and Turkey are linked in the economy, migration, and everyday life, the relationship has often been tense at the political level in recent decades. The developments in Ankara had a direct impact on the Turkish community in Germany. And so, the policy between Berlin and Ankara suddenly became a domestic political issue in Germany. EU accession negotiations and German skepticism. In the early 2000s, Turkey began to negotiate in earnest to join the European Union. Many in Germany were skeptical. Did Turkey, with its size, culture, and political situation, really fit into the EU? German politicians such as Angela Merkel or Edmund Stoiber in particular made it clear that they preferred a privileged partnership instead of full membership. For many Turks, this was a signal. No matter how much we reform ourselves, we will always remain foreign to Europe. This debate also affected the Turks in Germany. Many wondered, if Turkey is not seen as part of Europe, what does that mean for us here? Erdogan and the AKP. A decisive turning point was the rise of Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his AKP party from 2002 onwards. Under Erdogan, Turkey initially experienced an economic upswing, but later an increasingly authoritarian turn. It became particularly problematic that Erdogan also made politics in Germany, or at least tried to do so. At appearances in Cologne or Düsseldorf, he spoke to tens of thousands of supporters and shouted to them, "Assimilation is a crime against humanity." Such sentences triggered heated discussions in Germany. Was Erdogan a protector of the diaspora, or did he divide society? The coup attempt of 2016. A dramatic event brought tensions to a head, the coup attempt in Turkey in July 2016. In Ankara and Istanbul, parts of the military tried to overthrow Erdogan. The coup failed, but the consequences were serious. Tens of thousands of civil servants, teachers, judges, and soldiers were dismissed or arrested. The event also divided the community in Germany. Tens of thousands of Turks demonstrated on German streets either for or against Erdogan. Mosque associations, cultural centers, and families got into disputes. Suddenly, Turkish politics had arrived in the middle of Germany. DİTİB and Ankara's influence. Another controversial topic to this day is Turkey's influence on mosques in Germany. Many communities belong to the DİTİB Association, which is officially part of the Turkish religious authority. Critics say Ankara exerts direct influence on Muslims in Germany. So the question is, how independent can Turkish institutions be in Germany? And what does this mean for integration and living together? Diplomatic crises. German-Turkish relations have come to the brink of rupture several times in recent years. In 2017, German politicians were banned from campaigning in Turkey, while Erdogan wanted to appear in Germany. Several German journalists and activists were arrested in Turkey, leading to diplomatic crises. Erdogan himself described German politicians as Nazis, a provocation that caused outrage. A difficult partnership. Despite all the tensions, Turkey remains an important partner. As a NATO member, as a trading partner, as a country where millions of people have relatives who live in Germany. But the relationship is complicated, somewhere between closeness and mistrust. For the German Turks, this means that they are often doubly affected. The conflicts between Berlin and Ankara have a direct impact on their lives. And this makes it clear that the German-Turkish relationship is not just foreign policy, but has long been an issue of German domestic policy. Chapter 13: Successes and challenges of integration today. 60 years after the start of the recruitment agreement, it is clear that Turkish migration has changed Germany permanently. Millions of people with Turkish roots live here today, the vast majority of them in the second or third generation. Many were born, grew up, went to school in Germany, and have long felt at home. But integration is a long process. In addition to great successes, there are still challenges today. Educational paths and career advancement. A lot has happened in recent decades. More and more German Turks are making the leap to grammar school, studying at universities, working as doctors, lawyers, teachers, or engineers. They are now also represented in politics and administration, up to members of the Bundestag. The success is visible. Names like Cem Özdemir, Aydan Özoğuz, or Ekin Diligus today stand for a generation that has naturally arrived in German politics. At the same time, however, there are still differences. Statistically, children with a Turkish background still have poorer educational opportunities. Language barriers, social disadvantage, and prejudice play a role. Women in the Turkish community. The role of women is particularly exciting. In the first generation, many were mainly housewives, often integrated into traditional structures. Today, however, a lot has changed. Women of Turkish origin are studying, pursuing careers, and being self-employed. At the same time, however, there are debates about role models, about emancipation, about the meaning of religion and tradition. Headscarf or no headscarf, this remains a hotly debated topic, both in Germany and within the community. Religion in everyday life. Islam is also an important part of the lives of many German Turks. Ramadan, Friday prayers, or the Feast of Sacrifice are part of the course of the year. But at the same time, a generation is growing up that sees itself as secular and does not see religion at the center. The diversity is great, from the conservative mosque visitor to the secular German Turkish woman who sees herself more as a European, there are all facets. New debates, headscarf, belonging, identity. The public debate is often about symbols, the headscarf, the mosque, dual citizenship. Behind this is a bigger question. What does it mean to be at home in Germany? Many German Turks have long felt part of society, and they are. At the same time, they still experience prejudice or discrimination in everyday life. The fight for recognition is not yet over. From guest workers to members of the Bundestag. Probably the most impressive sign of the changes is politics. When the first Turkish guest workers came to Germany in the 1960s, no one would have thought that their children and grandchildren would one day help shape laws in the Bundestag. But today, this is reality. Politicians of Turkish origin shape debates on integration, climate, the economy, and foreign policy. They symbolize the long road, from guest worker in the factory to the people's representative in parliament. A mixed picture. The integration of Turks in Germany is therefore neither a success story nor a failure. It is an open process. There are impressive climbs, but also stubborn problems. There are people who feel completely at home and others who still feel alienated to this day. But one thing is clear: the Turks belong to Germany. Without them, this country would not be what it is today. Chapter 14. The German-Turkish Future. If we look at the last 60 years, it becomes clear that German-Turkish history is a history full of change. From the guest worker contract in 1961 to the third and fourth generations today, hardly any other migration has had such a strong impact on Germany. But what will happen in the future? Opportunities for the young generation. Perhaps the greatest hope lies in the young generation. Many of them were born in Germany, feel at home here, and, of course, carry several identities within them. They are German Turks, Europeans, citizens of the world, and it is precisely this diversity that makes them strong. They are becoming increasingly visible in culture, science, sports, and politics. Young doctors, startup founders, artists, or members of parliament show that the children and grandchildren of guest workers have long been more than migrants. They are co-creators of society. Challenges in living together. At the same time, there are still challenges. Topics such as integration, language promotion, educational justice, and equal opportunities will remain central in the future. It is above all in the school system that it is decided whether children with a Turkish background have the same opportunities as everyone else. The question of religion and belonging will also continue to occupy us. How can we succeed in integrating Muslim life into society as a matter of course without conflicts or mistrust? Political relations between Berlin and Ankara. Another factor is politics. As long as Turkey under Erdogan pursues an authoritarian course, there will also be tensions in Germany. But even when governments argue, human ties are so close that it is hard to imagine a break. More than 3 million people with Turkish roots in Germany mean that what happens in Ankara has a direct impact in Berlin, Cologne, or Hamburg. Turkey is thus not only a partner abroad, but part of the German reality. Germany as a country of immigration. Perhaps the most important insight for the future, Germany has long been a country of immigration. For a long time, this was denied, but today it is reality. The Turks played a pioneering role in this. They were the first large group to come and stay permanently. How we deal with diversity in the future will not only determine German-Turkish relations, but society as a whole. Moving forward together. The future will depend on whether we succeed in exploiting the potential, multilingualism, cultural diversity, economic dynamism. At the same time, problems such as discrimination, social inequality, or political tensions must be taken seriously. History shows that German-Turkish relations have never been easy, but they have always been important, and they will remain so. Chapter 15. Conclusion: 60 years and more of a special relationship. If we look back at the history of German-Turkish relations, we see a mosaic of alliances, migrations, crises, and successes. From the first contacts in the Ottoman Empire, to the brotherhood in arms in the First World War, to the arrival of guest workers in the 1960s, every era has left its mark. From guest worker to neighbor. What began as a temporary experiment in 1961 has changed Germany forever. Guest workers became neighbors, factory workers became entrepreneurs, immigrants became deputies. Today, people with Turkish roots belong to Germany as a matter of course, in schools, in companies, in politics, on football pitches, and on theater stages. Challenges and conflicts. Of course, the path was not easy. Racism, discrimination, and political tensions have put a strain on coexistence. Many Turks had to stand up to prejudices. Many Germans had to learn to deal with diversity. Even today, there are open questions. How can integration in schools and the labor market succeed? How do we deal with religion and cultural differences? A piece of shared history. But despite all the conflicts, something has emerged that can no longer be undone: a common history. The Turks are no longer the foreigners, but part of German memory. Their stories have become German stories. When we talk about the economic miracle today, we also have to talk about the guest workers. When we talk about German culture, kebabs, rap, and Turkish literature are part of it. When we talk about politics, we can't get past members of parliament of Turkish origin. An outlook. The German-Turkish story is not over. It continues. The children and grandchildren of the guest workers are actively involved in shaping the country. They bring new perspectives, connect cultures, and contribute to Germany becoming more diverse, dynamic, and open. The future will show how closely the two countries remain politically and culturally connected. But one thing is clear: Turkey and Germany have long been more than partner states. They are intertwined by millions of people. Final thoughts. 60 years after the recruitment agreement, we can say that German-Turkish relations are a reflection of our time. They show how difficult, but also how enriching migration can be. They make it clear that integration is not a goal that can be achieved at some point, but a process that is renegotiated every day. And they show one thing above all: that strangers can become friends, guests can become neighbors, and two different stories can become one together.